If the killing of one of Mexico's most powerful drug lords was a show of strength and purpose by the government, so the response has been a show of force by the cartels. Across the country, roads have been blocked, cars and buses torched, banks and shops set on fire by powerful criminal gangs intent on demonstrating their reach and deterring further action against them.
Terrifying, surreal, scary. These are some of the words that American tourist Jim Beck used on Sunday to describe the situation in Puerto Vallarta, a tourist town in Mexico's Jalisco state, as it turns into a war zone.
Right now, it is Wednesday, February 25th, 2026. If you look at the footage coming out of Mexico, the state of Jalisco is burning. There are 21 highway blockades on fire, sirens are screaming, and the city of Guadalajara is a ghost town. On the television, the governments of the United States and Mexico are celebrating. They are calling the death of El Mencho a victory for the Joint Interagency Task Force. They are bragging about billion-dollar spy satellites and the ultimate success of the Kingpin strategy. But while they congratulate themselves, I am sitting here looking at something else. I am cross-referencing thousands of confidential pages from the 2022 Guacamaya leaks against the movement logs of a specific, unknown woman from just 7 days ago. And the picture I see is completely different. It forces us to ask the core question, did the most dangerous man on the planet fall because of a satellite in space or because of a love letter found in a mistress's handbag? So, look, I am not here to repeat the CNN headlines. I have spent the last 72 hours digging through Sedena military files, tracking the timeline of a failing kidney and finding the name that was not supposed to be found. This is the story they are not telling you at the press conference. To understand why the events of this week are so earth-shattering, you first have to understand the man who just died. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The world knew him as El Mencho. But to the intelligence community, he was something far more frustrating. He was a ghost. For 15 years, the most powerful governments on earth hunted him. And for 15 years, he simply did not exist. I have been looking at the profiles of past cartel leaders to see what made this man different, and the contrast is startling. Think about El Chapo for a second. Joaquin Guzman was a celebrity criminal. He had an ego that was bigger than his empire. He wanted the fame. He was meeting Hollywood actors in the jungle, giving interviews to Sean Penn, sipping tequila while the world watched, and sending flirtatious text messages that the authorities could intercept. He wanted to be a legend, and that desire for attention is exactly what got him caught. El Mencho was the complete opposite. He was a shadow. He understood that in the modern age, silence is the only armor that actually works. He did not give interviews. He did not pose for photographs. In fact, until this week, there were fewer than 3 confirmed pictures of him in existence, and all of them were decades old. He was a police officer in his youth, and he used that training to disappear. He knew how the hunters thought, so he knew exactly how to become the prey that could never be found. So, how did he survive for 15 years with a $15 million bounty on his head? I dug into the tactical assessments from the Mexican military, and what I found was a strategy of extreme discipline. He did not use cell phones. He did not sleep in the same location for 2 consecutive nights. He moved constantly through the mountains of the Sierra Madre, a terrain so rugged and unforgiving that it swallows entire armies. He built what security experts call a ring of steel around himself. This was not just a few bodyguards standing outside a door, it was a sophisticated, military-grade defensive doctrine. The first layer was the halcones, or the hawks. These were networks of spotters positioned 10 kilometers away from his actual location. Teenagers with radios, farmers on the side of the road, taxi drivers in the nearest village, they were all eyes and ears. If a military convoy moved, or if a strange car entered the zone, El Mencho knew about it 20 minutes before they could even get close. The second layer was the firepower. And this is where El Mencho changed the game. He did not just arm his men with rifles. He armed them for war. We have to remember what happened in May of 2015. When the Mexican military tried to capture him, his sicarios did not just run away. They stood their ground and fired a rocket-propelled grenade at a military Cougar helicopter, blowing it right out of the sky. That was the message: come for me, and I will bring down your aircraft. That level of aggression created a zone of denial that kept law enforcement terrified for a decade. And then there was the third layer, the inner circle. These were not street thugs. These were former military mercenaries, deserters from special forces who were paid absolute fortunes to provide absolute loyalty. They were the only ones allowed within breathing distance of the boss. But here is the thing. The United States government spent billions of dollars on surveillance technology. They have drones that can read a license plate from space. They have signal interceptors that can catch a whisper on a cell phone line. So why couldn't they find him? The answer lies in the canopy of the Sierra Madre. Those mountains are covered in dense, thick jungle. American drones rely on heat, signatures, and visual confirmation. But El Mencho stayed under the trees. He stayed off the grid. If you do not turn on a phone, the National Security Agency cannot triangulate your position. If you do not light a fire in the open, the drones cannot see your heat. He defeated 21st century technology by living like a man from the 19th century. He stripped away every digital footprint until there was nothing left to track. So for a decade, he was invincible, a ghost. He was a phantom that could burn down cities but could not be touched by the law. But even ghosts have a weakness. You can run from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and you can hide from the Mexican Marines, but you cannot run from your own body. And for El Mencho, it was not a bullet that finally slowed him down. It was biology. So, let's talk about the biology. Let's talk about the one thing Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes could not bribe, threaten, or kill. For years, intelligence reports hinted at it, whispering about his deteriorating health in the mountains. But it was not until the year 2020 that the Mexican newspaper El Universal confirmed what the Drug Enforcement Administration had suspected for a long time. The most wanted man in the world was dying. He had end-stage renal disease. His kidneys were failing. Now, in the world of organized crime, a diagnosis like that is usually a death sentence, but not for the reasons you might think. It is not just about the physical weakness, it is about the logistics. When you are a fugitive, your survival depends on speed. You have to be able to move at a moment's notice. You have to be able to sleep on the ground, hike through the rain, and disappear into the brush when the helicopters get close. But kidney failure takes that freedom away from you. It puts a leash on you. To understand why this was the beginning of the end, you have to look at what El Mencho did next. He did something that seems almost insane for a man hiding from the American government. He built a hospital. I am not talking about a tent with a first aid kit. I am talking about a fully equipped medical facility in the tiny, remote community of El Alxihuatl, in the municipality of Villa Purificación, Jalisco. Reports indicate he constructed this clinic specifically for himself and his inner circle. Think about the arrogance of that. He was so confident in his control over the territory that he poured concrete and installed medical infrastructure in the middle of a conflict zone. But here is where the investigation shifts. The construction of that hospital was a tactical error. It was a fixed point on a map. For a ghost who survived by never being in the same place twice, building a permanent structure was a massive risk. It gave the hunters a coordinate. It gave them a location to watch. The problem is, dialysis cannot be done impromptu. You cannot just decide to do it whenever you feel like it. It is a medical procedure that requires a rigid, unbreakable schedule. Typically, a patient with his condition needs treatment 3 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Each session takes 3 to 4 hours. During those 4 hours, you are attached to a machine. Your blood is being cycled out of your body, cleaned, and pumped back in. You are vulnerable. You are immobile. And most importantly, you are predictable. And it goes beyond just the time commitment. Dialysis requires specific infrastructure. You need a stable source of electricity to run the machines. You cannot rely on a generator that might run out of fuel in the middle of a session. You need large quantities of perfectly purified water. You need sterilized equipment. You need a nephrologist, a specialist doctor who knows how to operate the machinery and handle complications. This disease forced El Mencho to change his entire modus operandi. He transformed from a mobile phantom into a tethered patient. He could no longer vanish into the deepest, darkest parts of the Sierra Madre for months at a time. He had to stay within a specific radius of his treatment center. He had to ensure the supply lines for his medical equipment were open. Every shipment of dialysis fluid was a potential breadcrumb. Every doctor brought up the mountain was a potential informant. Every 4-hour session was a window where his security was compromised. The intelligence agencies knew this. They stopped looking for a man running through the woods and started looking for the infrastructure of a hospital. They started tracking the logistics of a sick man. It creates a fascinating, terrifying paradox. The very thing he needed to stay alive, the treatment, was the very thing that made him vulnerable to capture. He was trapped in a dilemma. If he stopped the treatment, he would die from the toxins building up in his blood. If he continued the treatment, he had to expose himself to the grid. He chose to live. He chose to build the hospital, to bring in the doctors to maintain the schedule. He gambled that his ring of steel was strong enough to protect him while he was hooked up to a machine. He bet his empire on the idea that he could be a patient and a kingpin at the same time. It is a choice that reveals the human desperation behind the monster. And it leads me to a question I want to ask you. Because when you strip away the billions of dollars and the gold-plated guns, this is a decision about survival. Continuing with this section is his fatal mistake. To understand how we got to this point, we have to go back to October of 2022. That was the moment everything changed for the Mexican government. A group of hacktivists known as Guacamaya managed to breach the servers of SEDENA, the Secretariat of National Defense in Mexico. This was not a small data breach. We are talking about 6 terabytes of classified emails, military reports, and intelligence briefings being dumped onto the internet for the world to see. It was the largest cybersecurity failure in the history of the country. For journalists and investigators like me, this was a treasure trove. Suddenly, we could see exactly what the army knew, and more importantly, what they did not know. I spent days combing through those files, looking for mentions of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. There were thousands of documents. Most of them were standard operational reports, troop movements, seizures of fentanyl, arrests of low-level lookouts. But then, buried deep within the intelligence assessments regarding the inner circle of the cartel, a new name appeared. It was a name that did not belong to the famous crime families. It was not a Guzman. It was not a Valencia. It was a name that had never appeared on a Treasury sanctions list or a wanted poster. Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. When I first saw it, I had to double-check the spelling. Who was she? Why was her name highlighted in confidential military briefings? The documents revealed something fascinating about the structure of El Mencho's life. For years, we assumed his wife, Rosalinda, was the only woman with any real influence. And in a business sense, that was true. Rosalinda was the financial brain, she was the queen pin who washed the money. But by 2022, Rosalinda was in prison. She was locked away. So, who was taking care of the boss? The Guacamaya files described Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo not as a banned substances trafficker, but as a coordinator. Her role was not to move cocaine. Her role was to move comfort. She was described as the person responsible for the logistics of his personal life in the Sierra. Think about what that actually entails for a man in hiding. It means she was the one organizing his meals. She was the one ensuring he had clean clothes. She was the one managing the rotating staff of housekeepers and cooks who were blindfolded before being taken up the mountain. But most critically, the intelligence reports identified her as the person coordinating his health. She was the bridge. She was the one who ensured that the dialysis fluid arrived on time. She was the one who managed the delivery of the specific dietary foods a kidney patient needs to survive. And this is important. In one of the leaked documents, there was a stunning admission by the Mexican military. The report essentially stated that they had lost track of El Mencho himself. His security protocols were too good. He had gone completely dark. They could not find his radio signal. They could not find his phone. They could not find his heat signature. However, the report noted a shift in strategy. They admitted that while they could not track the ghost, they could track the woman who was keeping the ghost alive. This is a classic technique in intelligence gathering called pattern of life analysis. You stop looking for the hard target, and you start looking for the soft target. El Mencho might not use a phone, but the supply chain for his medicine requires communication. The military began to build a profile on Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. They started mapping her movements. They watched where she went, who she spoke to, and what she purchased. Every time she moved supplies into the municipality of Villa Purificación, she was creating a data point. Every time she coordinated a delivery of medical equipment to a remote cabin, she was drawing a line on a map for the intelligence analysts to follow. She thought she was just being a loyal partner. She thought she was just taking care of a sick man who needed her help. She likely believed that because she was not ordering hits or smuggling banned substances, she was invisible to the radar of the state. She was wrong. In their desperation to find the kingpin, the authorities turned his reliance on her into his greatest vulnerability. They realized that wherever Guadalupe went, El Mencho was either there, or he was waiting for her to arrive. She was the only constant variable in an equation designed to be unsolvable. Which means the mistress became the beacon. Unknowingly, she was carrying a target on her back every time she went up that mountain. So, we have the ghost in the mountains, the disease that tethered him to the earth, and the mistress who inadvertently lit the path for the drones. But if you think that is the whole story, you are missing the most critical piece of the puzzle. You are missing the queen. To understand the final act of this tragedy, we have to talk about Rosalinda González Valencia. In the underworld, she is known simply as La Jefa, the boss. And that is not a nickname given out of affection, it is a title earned through ruthless financial efficiency. Rosalinda is not just the wife of El Mencho. She is the sister of the Queeness, a clan of brothers who are widely considered by the Drug Enforcement Administration to be the wealthiest banned substances traffickers in the world. While El Mencho was the military muscle, fighting wars and shooting down helicopters, Rosalinda and her brothers were the corporate boardroom. They were the ones washing the billions of dollars through real estate, hotels, and legitimate businesses. They were the bank. But here is where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. And I need you to pay close attention to these dates because the coincidence is almost too perfect to believe. In November of 2021, Rosalinda was arrested by the Mexican military in a dramatic operation in Zapopan. She was taken into custody, effectively removing the financial brain from the military body of the cartel. For 3 years, she sat in a federal prison, watching the empire from the inside of a cell. Then came February of 2025. Exactly 1 year ago, almost to the day, Rosalinda was released. The legal reasons were complicated: health issues, lack of evidence on certain charges, but the result was simple. She was back on the street. She was free. Now, put yourself in her shoes for a moment. You are a woman who has spent decades building a dynasty. You come out of prison, and what do you find? You find your husband, the king, in a state of rapid decay. He is dying of kidney failure, he is weak, he is vulnerable. But worse than that, he is not alone. He is being cared for by another woman. Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. This is not just a matter of romantic jealousy. In the world of the cartel, proximity is power. The person who changes the dialysis bag is the person who whispers in the ear of the leader. The person who controls the medicine controls the man. Rosalinda would have realized instantly that Guadalupe was not just a nurse or a lover, she was a gatekeeper. She was a potential threat to the inheritance. If El Mencho died while under the total influence of his mistress, where would the codes to the bank accounts go? Where would the locations of the buried cash reserves go? Would they go to the loyal wife who spent 3 years in prison, or would they go to the woman who was holding his hand in the mountains? For a woman like Rosalinda, who represents the interests of the Valencia family, that is an unacceptable risk. You do not build a billion-dollar empire just to watch it slip away to a mistress in the final hour. This brings us to the most chilling theory circulating in intelligence channels right now. It is a theory that suggests the fall of El Mencho was not just an operation, it was a liquidation. Analyze the year between February 2025 and February 2026. This was the year Rosalinda was back in charge. This was the year the intelligence on Guadalupe's movements suddenly became much more precise. Is it possible that the leaks regarding the mistress's location did not come from a hacked server, but from a tip-off? There is a concept in intelligence called a controlled burn. Sometimes, to save the forest, you have to burn down a few trees. If Rosalinda believed that her husband was already a dead man walking, that the kidney failure was going to kill him anyway, then he was no longer an asset. He was a liability. His continued freedom meant continued scrutiny, continued heat, and the continued influence of the mistress. But a dead husband is a legend. A dead husband cannot change his will. A dead husband cannot give away the keys to the kingdom to a lover. And most importantly, if the government takes him out, the wife looks like a grieving widow, not a conspirator. It is the perfect consolidation of power. You remove the rival woman by leading the drones to her doorstep. You remove the dying leader before he can make any foolish decisions. You secure the financial future for your children, ensuring that the Valencia bloodline keeps the money, even if the Oseguera bloodline loses the war. When you look at it through this lens, the raid on Tapalpa looks less like a capture operation and more like a changing of the guard. It explains why he was in a vulnerable location. It explains why the security layers failed. It explains why, just 12 months after the Queen returned, the King fell. It is a theory that makes you question the nature of loyalty in this brutal world. We want to believe in the stand by your man narrative, but when billions of dollars are on the table, love is often the first casualty. So, I have to ask you this, because it is the question that keeps me up at night looking at these files. Do you think a wife would sell out her husband to save her children's inheritance? Or is that just a conspiracy theory? I want to hear your take. To understand the end, we have to look at the map. We have to look at the specific coordinates where the 15-year manhunt finally came to a stop, because the location tells us everything about the desperation of the final hours. The raid did not happen in a cave. It did not happen in a bunker buried under the jungle canopy where satellites cannot see. It happened in Tapalpa. Now, if you know anything about Jalisco, you know that Tapalpa is not a fortress. It is what the Mexican government calls a pueblo mágico, a magic town. It is a weekend getaway for wealthy families from Guadalajara. It is a place of cobblestone streets, pine forests, luxury cabins, and fireplaces. It is a place where tourists go to drink wine and relax. It is the last place on earth you would expect to find the leader of the most violent paramilitary organization in the Western Hemisphere. So, why was he there? Why leave the absolute safety of the deep Sierra for a tourist town that is full of civilians and accessible by paved roads? The intelligence briefing that authorized the mission on the night of February 21, 2026, suggests two critical motivators, and both of them circle back to the two weaknesses we have been discussing: his failing body and his entangled heart. The first theory is medical. Sources indicate that El Mencho had suffered a crashing episode. His kidneys were shutting down faster than the portable equipment in the mountains could handle. He needed a stable environment. He needed a clean room, consistent voltage for the dialysis machine, and the kind of sterility you cannot get in a dirt floor safe house. Tapalpa offered luxury cabins with reliable power grids. He was literally betting his life that he could hide in plain sight for one night to clean his blood. The second theory is financial, and it involves Guadalupe. There is strong speculation that this was a handover meeting. If El Mencho knew he was dying, he needed to physically transfer the codes, the ledger books, and the access keys to the hidden assets managed by his mistress. You do not do that over a radio frequency that the Drug Enforcement Administration can intercept. You do that face to face, in a room with a fireplace, while the clock ticks down. What happened next was a masterclass in surveillance, but with a twist. The satellites orbiting overhead, they were not tracking El Mencho's phone, because he didn't have one. They were not tracking his heat signature, because he had been stationary for hours. They were tracking her. At roughly 11 o'clock at night on February 21st, high-altitude surveillance drones picked up a convoy of 3 armored SUVs moving up the winding roads toward Tapalpa. The heat signatures from the engine blocks were unmistakable against the cold mountain air. The analysts watching the screens in Mexico City and Washington, D.C., noticed something specific about this convoy. It was moving with aggressive protection protocols, speeding up at choke points, slowing down to scan intersections. But it was not the massive 50-truck convoy of a cartel army. It was a small, intimate extraction team. The intelligence assessment was immediate. This is the Mistress. She is moving to the target. They let the convoy pass. They let her lead them right to the doorstep. The SUVs pulled into a secluded, high-end compound on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by tall pine trees. The heat signatures stopped, the engines cooled down, and for the next 4 hours the house went dark. The military did not rush in. They waited. They triangulated the position. They used thermal imaging to look through the walls of the cabin. They identified a specific room on the ground floor that was generating a different kind of heat signature, the steady, rhythmic heat of electronic medical equipment running non-stop. They knew exactly where he was. They knew he was hooked up to the machine. He was tethered. At 4 in the morning on February 22nd, the operation launched. This was not a siege. This was a surgical extraction. Special Forces units from the Mexican Army, supported by National Guard perimeter teams, descended on the compound. They did not attack blindly. They breached the specific wall of the specific room where the dialysis machine was humming. The firefight was intense but short. The bodyguards were taken by surprise. They were prepared for a fight in the jungle, not a breach in a luxury bedroom while their boss was incapacitated. When the smoke cleared and the soldiers entered the room, the scene was not what you would expect from a narco thriller. There was no man standing on a balcony with a golden rifle screaming at the sky. There was just a frail, sick man, disconnected from a machine, surrounded by tubes and saline bags. But here is where the story gets messy. They didn't just find him, they found him dying. The sun was just beginning to break over the peaks of the Sierra Madre when the radio call went out. It was the signal that two governments had been waiting 15 years to hear. Target secured. At 5:30 in the morning on February 22nd, the Mexican military confirmed that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was in custody. He was alive. He was breathing. He was in handcuffs. For a brief window of time, about 20 minutes, the world believed that the king had finally been checkmated. The plan was standard procedure: secure the high-value target, transport him immediately to a maximum security military airfield, and fly him to Mexico City for processing, interrogation, and eventually, extradition to the United States. But 20 minutes later, the narrative changed. The official communique stated that during the transport, the prisoner's health rapidly deteriorated. They claimed that the stress of the capture, combined with his advanced stage of kidney failure, caused a catastrophic medical event. By the time the helicopter touched down, El Mencho was dead. But here is where the geography starts to argue with the official story. Tapalpa is located in the state of Jalisco. It is roughly 80 miles south of Guadalajara. Guadalajara is the second largest city in Mexico. It has world-class trauma centers, university hospitals, and specialists who could have stabilized a dying man in under 30 minutes. If the priority was to keep the most valuable intelligence asset in the world alive, you would put him in an ambulance and drive him north. Or you would fly him 5 minutes to the nearest city. You do not put a dying man on a Black Hawk helicopter for a 400-mile flight to Mexico City. That is a flight path that takes over an hour and a half across high-altitude mountain ranges. At this point, I started questioning the official narrative. We have to look at this through the lens of political survival, not just medical survival. An alive El Mencho is a nuclear bomb of information. Think about it. This is a man who built a $50 billion empire. You do not do that without friends in high places. You do not move that much product without paying off governors, generals, judges, and police chiefs. If El Mencho sits in a courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, just like El Chapo did, he is going to start naming names. He is going to talk about the bribes. He is going to talk about the pacts made with the state. He is going to expose the rot in the system. But a dead El Mencho is a trophy. He is a victory speech for the president. He is a mission accomplished banner for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And most importantly, he is silent. A dead cartel boss takes his payroll list to the grave. So, was the decision to fly him to Mexico City instead of a local hospital a logistical error? Or was it a calculated decision to let nature take its course? Was the medical emergency on the helicopter a heart attack, or was it a convenient delay in treatment? And then there is the other loose end, the ghost in the room, Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo. In the chaos of the raid reports, her name has vanished. The initial intelligence said she was there. The heat signatures said she was there. But the arrest report lists only the capture of El Mencho and 2 unidentified bodyguards. Where is she? Did she slip out the back door into the pine forest while the soldiers breached the front? That seems unlikely given the ring of steel perimeter the military claimed to have established. Or is there a darker possibility? Guadalupe was the one who knew where the money was buried. She was the one holding the keys to the kingdom that Rosalinda wanted back. If she was captured, she would be a witness. If she was killed, she would be a victim. But if she simply disappeared, then the secrets she held could be quietly transferred to new management. There are rumors, unconfirmed, but persistent, that a second helicopter left the area that morning. A smaller transport, one that did not go to Mexico City. One that carried a passenger who was very much alive and very much in possession of the codes to the financial empire. We are left with a picture that is almost too perfect. The king is dead, removing the threat of a trial. The queen is back on the throne, with her rivals removed. And the government gets to claim they took down the monster, without having to deal with the messy reality of what created him. It brings us back to the oldest saying in the world of crime. It is a cliché because it is true. Dead men tell no tales. So, I have to ask you, and I want you to be honest. Do you think he really died from kidney failure on that helicopter, or was he helped along the way to silence him forever? Was it a medical tragedy? Or was it the final, necessary step in a controlled burn? operation. Let me know what you believe in the comments below. Because from where I am sitting, the official story has more holes in it than the helicopter he died in. So here we are. It is 3 days later. The smoke is still rising over the skyline of Guadalajara. The politicians in Washington and Mexico City are shaking hands, pinning medals on chests, and declaring the end of an era. But as I close these files, the Guacamaya leaks, the Sedena reports, the hospital blueprints, I am left with a very different picture of what just happened. I have spent this entire journey trying to separate the myth from the man. And what I found is that the official story is a comfortable lie. They want you to believe that El Mencho fell because of the superior firepower of the state. They want you to believe that billion-dollar spy satellites and joint task forces finally outsmarted the criminal mastermind. But that is not what the evidence says. When you strip away the press conferences and look at the raw data, you realize that El Mencho did not lose this war because the United States Marines kicked down his door. He did not lose because a Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile into a bunker. He lost because of two things that no amount of money, power, or violence can fix: biology and psychology. Let's look at the biology first. For 15 years, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was a ghost. He was untraceable. But the moment his kidneys began to fail, he ceased to be a ghost and became a patient. You cannot run a paramilitary empire while you are tethered to a dialysis machine for 12 hours a week. That machine was his anchor. It forced him to build a hospital. It forced him to stay in Tapalpa. It forced him to rely on a supply chain of medicine that could be tracked. His own body betrayed him long before the first soldier breached that room. And then there is the psychology. Specifically, the psychology of the women in his life. We often look at cartels as these hyper-masculine organizations, but in this case, the fate of the most powerful man in the Americas was decided by a domestic dispute. Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo, the mistress, was the key. She was the one who created the digital trail. She was the one who led the drones to the doorstep. But you have to ask yourself, who turned that key? I keep going back to the timeline of Rosalinda González Valencia, the wife, the queen. She sits in a prison cell for 3 years, watching her husband's health fail and watching another woman take her place at his side. She gets released in February of 2025. Exactly 1 year later, almost to the day, her husband is dead, her rival is gone, and her family's financial future is secure. That is not a coincidence. That is a hostile takeover. The intelligence suggests that El Mencho was not caught. He was served up. He was sacrificed on the altar of the business. Rosalinda and the Queen's clan likely realized that a dying leader is a liability, but a dead legend is an asset. By allowing the mistress to be the one who, accidentally, revealed his location, they killed 2 birds with 1 stone. They removed the husband before he could lose the money, and they framed the mistress for the fall. And that brings us to the real takeaway of this entire saga. It is not about banned substances. It is not about borders. It is about human frailty. The lesson here is chilling. In the world of organized crime, your body and your heart are bigger liabilities than the Drug Enforcement Administration. You can armor a truck, but you cannot armor a failing organ or a jealous partner. El Mencho spent millions of dollars on gold-plated .50 caliber rifles to shoot down helicopters, but he could not buy a new pair of kidneys, and he could not buy loyalty from a wife who saw her inheritance slipping away. So, I want to know what you think. I really want to hear your perspective on this. Do you buy the official story of a lucky satellite find and a medical emergency on the helicopter? Or do you believe in the medical trap theory? Do you think he was betrayed by his own biology and the women in his life? Leave a comment below. I read all of them, and I really want to see if you guys are seeing the same patterns I am. As for what happens next, look at the news. Jalisco is burning. The vacuum of power is being filled with violence as the splinter cells fight for control. The government is celebrating, but the people are hiding in their homes. Rosalinda is sitting in silence, likely surrounded by lawyers, secure in her position as the grieving widow. But there is one loose thread that keeps nagging at me. There are rumors, just whispers in the intelligence community right now, that Guadalupe Moreno Carrillo was seen crossing the border into Guatemala yesterday. And she was not empty-handed. They say she has the encryption keys to the Swiss accounts that El Mencho gave her in those final hours. And if that is true, the war isn't over. It is just changing owners. Thanks for watching. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, hit that subscribe button. It helps me keep digging into the files the mainstream media ignores. I'll be back soon with more updates on this case. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and keep questioning the official story.